Queen's Gender Initiative is celebrating its 21st anniversary this year. I'm delighted to welcome you to the virtual tour of the portraits in the Great Hall today. Over the last 20 years, QGI has been changing the face of Queens and bringing visibility to the women who have had prominent roles throughout Queens. I'd like to introduce you to Ben Crothers and Denise Price, who will be taking us on this tour today.
So Ben, thank you very much for taking the time to meet today to speak to us about the collection. QGI has been involved in the development of the university's permanent art collection now for over 20 years, but the relationship with the Naughton Gallery, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting in that the Naughton Gallery was established around the same time as QGI, so it sort of matured in the university together. But the actual art collection at Queen's dates right back to 1845. So it's really nice that they sort of sit side by side in history in that way. And even though we have a diverse collection in a lot of ways, women were largely underrepresented both as subjects and as artists right throughout the collection. And that really aligned very much with the goals of QGI in terms of making women much more visible at Queen's. And so we embarked upon this project together. So to give you a little bit of background about the painting we're going to talk about first today, representatives from QGI worked with the previous curator of the art collection, and there was an open call competition that went right out. It was an international competition and it had a huge reach and many applicants, 6 of whom were invited to come and give presentations to a panel to make more formal presentations on their work. And finally it was Michelle Rogers, who you see here today, who was selected as the winner of that.
And what's the title of the piece, and can you tell me what it depicts?
Sure, so this piece is called Out of the Shadows, and yeah, I think it works in 2 ways. One, as an inspirational piece in terms of challenging or encouraging or inviting women to see themselves in all these different roles, whether it be Pro-Vice Chancellor, a caterer, a lecturer, a technician, whatever that might be. And then the flip side of that is it's drawing attention to the numerous women who already occupy these roles within Queen's. So what you asked in terms of if anyone in particular is depicted here, the answer is no. There are these more sort of anonymous every woman. We see women from all walks of life. We see different races and ethnicities. We see a mother, we see another woman in a wheelchair. It's really looking at diversity right across the spectrum of women at Queen's and also larger society, I would say.
Okay. And are there any portraits of individuals?
Yes, that is actually the next stage of QGI's project, where whilst this, as I say, represents a kind of every woman, they wanted to focus more on individuals, many of whom made up these roles that are around the edge of the painting. They're mainly on display in the Great Hall, if you would like to go there and have a look at those next.
Yeah, please.
So here we are in the Great Hall, which is home to over 60 portraits from our collection. We have a lot of people represented here, from previous chancellors and vice chancellors. We have academics, and we have a lot of famous faces who have a connection to Queen's in some way. Interesting though, until 2000, the only woman represented in the hall was that of Queen Victoria in this 1838 portrait by Sir George Hayter. It was in 2000 that we decided to work with QGI in terms of developing a new project that would see us commissioning a range of famous women with a connection to Queen's.
So can you tell me how that process began? Who was the first person chosen to be a subject of a QGI portrait?
Well, here we have Molly McGeown, who was actually a really obvious first choice for us in terms of commissioning these portraits. She was a medical student at Queen's in the 1940s, and she had a really exemplary career as a student. But unfortunately, due to her position as a married woman, she found it really difficult to gain employment. She really persevered with her career though, and eventually the Belfast City Hospital employed her to set up and run the first dialysis unit here. She had to train a team and also had to learn how to use the equipment herself, and she ultimately came up with what was known as the Belfast recipe, which went on to save thousands of lives. Molly's really significant in terms of her recognition internationally and also across the UK, and she was named as one of 50 women who contributed most to the success of the NHS throughout its history. And in many ways people think of her as a bit of a matriarch of our collection. Here she is in the centre of the hall.
And thereafter, can you tell me how the collection has evolved?
Yes, so we've really diversified the collection over the last 20 years, commissioning portraits of women who work across a range of fields. So in terms of politics, we have the likes of Mary McAleese, who was the first female Pro-Vice-Chancellor here at Queen's and went on to become President of Ireland. We have Elizabeth Meehan, who was the first female politics professor across all of Ireland. And we also have Baroness Blood, who sat in the House of Lords for a number of years. Moving into the arts, we have figures such as Edna Longley and Maeve McGuckin, who are known in the literary world. And we have Margaret Mullet, who's actually a former director of QGI. And then moving into science and medicine, we have a lot of medical portraits, both of men and women, and we're really diversifying that in terms of bringing more women into that field, such as Ruth Linden Bell and neuropathologist Damien Gridallen.
That's very interesting, and it clearly shows the diversity of the disciplines. But how are the sitters chosen? Who selects the people to be represented by portraits?
Okay, so in that area, I would say the QGI very much takes the lead, and they will often come to us with people in mind who they want to mark or celebrate in some way. Oftentimes, schools or faculties will also have people in mind. They've become more aware of QGI's project just through its exposure over the years. So they often come to the gallery or to QGI with pockets of money that they want to invest in celebrating women within their own areas.
Okay, and the artists then, how are they chosen?
That's a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complicated as well. We really have a range of factors to consider. So from my point of view, in terms of the overall art collection, we want it to be as diverse a collection as possible. Typically when commissioning portraits for the Great Hall, we like to work with Irish portrait artists. But certainly not exclusively, and there's artists really based from throughout the UK and internationally on display here. And oftentimes people who are approached by QGI to have their portrait commissioned have artists in mind. Some have been to the Great Hall, they have particular favourite portraits. It's obviously great that they're invested in that process, but we also want to work with them in terms of diversifying our collection a lot more, so we can often introduce them to new artists. But I think what's important to remember throughout is that this is a really intimate and special experience for the sitter, and as much as it's important to get a stylistic match, I think a personality match is really important. Even if an artist works from photographs, they will be back and forth with the sitter throughout the process, and it's really important that they develop a rapport, and I think that comes through in so many of the works. And as a sitter, I think you put so much trust in a portrait artist, and it's really interesting to see how people kind of negotiate that relationship. Some like to see the portrait at several times throughout the process. Others want to be surprised on the day of the unveiling and get a real surprise as to what their portrait looks like.
And there's a wonderful range of artistic styles. So how do you manage to curate such a diverse collection and make them appear coherent?
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge, particularly as we start to engage with much more contemporary artists. So there's really two things to consider. One will be the formality of the Great Hall, and we need an artist to make new work that still feels in keeping with the more historic portraits that we have on display here. But the flip side of that is that we also want an artist to be able to stay true to their practice, and if they are a more experimental contemporary artist, we want them to still feel that their style is represented in their final portrait.
And I'm particularly drawn to this one here, which I notice is the only one without a frame.
Yes.
What can you say about that?
Yes, so this piece is by John Kindness, and it's a portrait of Elizabeth Meehan. John's probably best known in Belfast for the big fish sculpture down at the waterfront. And yes, a really unusual approach. It almost looks digital, but it is still a painting, and it's painted directly onto aluminium, which again, the majority of works here are either on board or canvas. It also stands out because it's the only portrait we have in profile view as well. Again, really makes it stand out, but I think whilst it stands out, the heritage colours, and it still feels very fitting for the Great Hall and as a more contemporary work. And I think we see that in a number of pieces, particularly in terms of our women actually being more recent portrait commissions that really stand out in that way. So the likes of Margaret Mullet's portrait, which is by Stephen Johnson. He often paints people with buckets on their head or halfway up a ladder holding a light bulb, and he really suited Margaret's personality, and she loved his work. But again, we had to work out how to rein that in and make it fit within the Great Hall. Another great example is Jennifer Troughton, who painted our portrait of Ruth Lyndon Bell. Jennifer isn't actually known as a portrait artist. She works much more with fabric and drapery, and she had painted one portrait of her mother, which my predecessor had seen at the time and had approached Jennifer about the commission, and she was really quite surprised to be commissioned as a portrait artist. But it's really interesting to see how her own personal style adapts into a more formal portrait.
Well, it's interesting what you say, that she works with fabric, so I'm drawn to the fabric, obviously, of the dress, but particularly the background and the wallpaper. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, so there's lots to unpack in this painting, both kind of professional and personal. So from a professional point of view, Ruth is a chemist, and she worked between Murray Edwards College in Cambridge and here at Queen's. And yeah, so this is one painting I would say, perhaps above all, that really merits a closer inspection. I'll talk about the background of the wallpaper first. So Jennifer would incorporate wallpapers into a lot of her work. It's all hand painted, it looks digitally screened, but it's very fine detail. The artist Jennifer incorporated elements of the Murray Edwards crest and the Queen's University crest. So she has different imagery within that. Adding another layer of detail, she also takes a lot of Ruth's chemical equations, and they're all incorporated into the design somewhere, which really kind of merits closer inspection. And as if that wasn't challenge enough, we then have the dress. And that's a more personal story, which really captures a lot of Ruth's personality. Every year she would go to Liberty department store in London and purchase Liberty print fabric, and she made herself a different dress every year. Jennifer heard this story and her own interest in fabric said, you have to wear this. And I think she maybe had some regrets when she actually saw it and had the challenge of painting this dress. But I think the contrast between these two patterns works brilliantly, and this portrait is commented on time and time again for its use of fabrics and materials.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. Do any of the others have hidden details?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting detail. It's fun to unpack, in that as much as a portrait is of a person, often there's like hidden meanings or signifiers within the paintings. So here, for example, we have a portrait of Brenda McLaughlin, who was a founding member of QGI, in this portrait by Irish artist Cole Casey. Her jewellery was really significant to her in terms of what she selected, in terms of her ring, her brooch, her watch, and her necklace is actually her retirement gift upon leaving Queen's. My personal favourite detail is the letter that she's actually writing, and it's to Yvonne Galligan, who was the director of QGI at the time. And if you get close enough, you can actually make out the letters and read the start of this letter. So I think that's a really fun detail. Another one that's really interesting is our portrait of Jean Orr by Benita Stoney. Really interesting in that it's our only painting to feature another artwork from our collection in the painting. Jane was the founder of the School of Nursing and Midwifery here at Queen's, and under her directorship she commissioned a large ceramic quilt which hangs on the MBC today. She's an art lover herself, and I think it's really nice that we were able to find a way to incorporate a piece that she was so involved in terms of our wider collection and incorporate that into her portrait.
That's very interesting to learn more about the artists and the sitters and the process behind it. And as we look at these women, we know that many of them are still leading and pioneering in their fields and very, very much active in their careers. What can you tell me about the future of the collection? Who can we look forward to next?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you pick up on there, and we really want this space to be inspirational for students. And whilst the women on display here are very established within their fields, it's important to remember a lot of them studied at Queen's and were really pioneering from an early age. So that's something we really want to reflect. I'm really delighted that we have a new portrait commission coming up in the autumn, which we're looking forward to unveiling. And longer term, and very significantly in terms of the collection, we will have our first female portrait on the opposite wall, where we have our chancellors and vice chancellors. Last year, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton was appointed as the university's first female chancellor, and I think her portrait commission will be a really exciting way of continuing to diversify our collection.
So we've learned a lot about the sitters. Are you able to tell us anything about the diversity of the artists represented in the Great Hall?
Yes, that's something that I'm really keen to look at as well, in terms of, even though we are developing our portraits of women, we still have relatively few female artists represented in our collection. So that's something that we're really interested in expanding on. And then, as much as 20 years ago, QGI was looking to diversify in terms of gender, we also have a long way to go in terms of issues around race, disability, sexuality, and I think all these things will really come through in the collection, hopefully over the next 20 years.
So thank you very much for today and for sharing of your time and your evident pride in the collection. It's been marvellous. Thank you very much.